So this is one of my subscribers named Anthony, and after watching my channel, he was inspired to do an enduro e-bike build of his own. Everything was going well until he ran into some issues. After a while, he decided to contact me for help, and I was like, I got you. So we decided that it was best if he brought all of his parts over to my house so that I could build his bike for him and do a great video for you guys. And the result was, let's just say, incredible.
Woo! Baby, give me a little more. 59.
So in this video, I'm going to be showing you guys the step-by-step process of how I built this fan's incredible bike. Now, if you haven't already, make sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button because I'm doing videos like this all the time, and you subscribing allows me to do more. And also make sure to go ahead, follow this channel's Instagram so you can get behind the scenes footage of what goes on with these builds. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So when my subscriber dropped off his parts, most of it was still in the box and everything was pretty disorganized. So before we can even think about building this bike, the first step was to organize everything. Once we had done that, there were still 2 unboxings left for us to do. These boxes were not given to me by my subscriber, but were instead sent by a company named RFLOXA. I know, it sounds like something Elon Musk would name his kid. Anyways, this company makes the highest end Sur-Ron/Talaria Sting suspension, and they were kind enough to send me a pair for free to put on this bike. The best part is that I'm letting my subscriber keep this suspension once I finish his build, and he has no idea I'm doing this for him. So we're gonna get rid of these old Zoom forks and replace them with these bad boys. And with that, we finally have everything we need to build this badass enduro e-bike. So before we can start assembling this bike, we first have to drill a massive hole into the bottom of our frame. Now you might be asking yourself, why are we drilling this hole? And that's a good question. It's because we're going to be mounting a cooling fan on this bike later in this video, and we have to get this drilling out of the way before we start building our bike. So as you can see, I measure out where I want my fan to be. I outline the fan with a marker, and then I get cutting away. To cut this hole, I'm using a Dremel tool with some metal cutting bits. You can get these Dremels at any hardware store for about $60. They work super good for this kind of stuff, and this whole process took me about 20 minutes. Once we're satisfied with our new hole, I make sure to give this frame a blow job. This way we can get off all of those metal shavings. Once we're satisfied with our result, it's time to connect the 2 halves of our frame. You can do this with a bolt that is provided with your frame. You want to make sure that this is nice and tight so that your bike does not rattle around while you're riding on it. So the next step would usually be to install the headset cups into this frame, but this guy already installed them and it's a pain in the ass to remove them, so we're just going to go ahead and skip over that part. On to our beautiful forks. We're going to go ahead and install these. The first step is to slide this little bottom piece onto your steerer tube. Then we're going to go ahead, smite the ground with these forks and slide them into our frame. And once we got that out of the way, we can take the top piece of our headset and slide that onto the steerer tube. Now you want to make sure that your headsets are nice and greased. This is going to reduce any wear and tear that you might experience on your journey of riding this bike. After topping it off with your forks crown, we're going to go ahead and install our stem. I'm using this one from a company named Wake. You can use whatever stem you want. Then we're going to screw in the top cap. What this is going to do is clamp our forks together and make sure that they're nice and tight. And with all that, go ahead, pat yourself on the back because we're about 15% done with this build. But man, look at these forks. These are so clean and I can't wait to see what my subscriber thinks about these. After admiring our forks, it was time to install our handlebars. This guy gave me some Sur-Ron bars to install with this bike. These were a little bit too low in my opinion, so I later found some 3-inch risers which I installed on this bike off camera. After installing our beautiful Sur-Ron handlebars, it was time to install the rear shock. Now, I was hoping to install this rear shock made by the same company that made our forks, but as you can see, they were a little bit too long. They're made for a different bike frame like the Sur-Ron or Talaria Sting. Instead, I opted in for just using the rear shock that the guy gave me with this bike. This is the D&M Burner 2S. It's the old reliable, costs like 150 bucks, can't go wrong with it. After this, our bike was looking pretty darn good, and honestly, I think it's ready to ride. We can just take it out right now. Just kidding. It's time to install our subframe. This is what we're going to be adding our seat to later in this video. A little pro tip here is to add some spacers in between this subframe and our main frame so that we can tilt it back a little bit, because the stock angle that it comes at is way too high and makes you slide off the seat towards the main frame. Another pro tip is to subscribe to this channel because I'm doing videos like this all the time, and you subscribing allows me to do more insane build projects. Also, don't forget to follow this channel's Instagram so that you can stay in the loop with what's going on behind the scenes. Next up, we can go ahead and install our Enduro e-bike seat simply by sliding it on and screwing this bad boy in. After putting on our seat, it's front wheel time, baby, and we're going to be installing the disc rotor onto this bad boy. Now, for these forks specifically, they have a little spacer system that you're supposed to use with them. As you'll see in a little bit, this wasn't really the correct wheel size for these forks specifically, but I actually figured out a way to get these mounted onto these forks without having to switch over to something like a Sur-on wheel. So I go ahead, screw the mounts into this wheel, add the brake rotor, get everything nice and tightened up using Loctite of course, and here's how we're looking, boys. Ready to move on to the next step. So after smiting the ground with this wheel so that the e-bike gods bless us, I go ahead and flip this bike over so we can slide this wheel onto our forks. But after installing this wheel and sliding in our axle, this is where I realized that we had a little bit of an issue that we needed to solve.
Alright, so loving this fork wheel combo, looks super awesome. Only problem is this wheel is incompatible with this fork. I didn't realize that when I got this thing sent out to me, but as you can see, the axle is too wide. And as you can see, it still fits. So you're wondering, why is the axle too wide? Well, this is meant to be used with a spacer here, right? And as you can see, the spacer doesn't fit. So if this axle was maybe a little bit shorter, or maybe like the correct size, this would just slide in and everything would fit perfectly fine, but it doesn't. So what I'm gonna need to do, if it's gonna focus for me, what I need to do is make my own spacer, and then we should be all good to go.
So after measuring out how many spacers we needed, I took my fine ass down to the hardware store to figure out what the perfect spacer was going to be for these forks. Using an axle bolt that was the same size as the ones that I have on my current forks, I searched for the perfect candidate to be the spacer, and I found it. It was these little carbon shims. I'll put the exact name of them on the screen, but they worked perfectly. I lucked out because the tolerance that these fit on the axle bolt was insane.
Alright, so we're back home, and as you can see, it only takes 3 of these shims to fill this space, which is perfect. I think we really lucked out with getting these. I'm gonna go ahead, take this wheel off, and we're gonna go ahead and see how this works.
Alright, so I was capping. We didn't have to take the entire wheel off. All I had to do was slide this axle out, put our spacers on, and put it back together. And as you can see, this worked really well. I was very relieved because I was worried that this was going to be a big issue, but it really wasn't. Now, if you wanted to bypass this altogether, just get a Sur-on wheel if you're planning to use it with these forks. So once we got that headache out of the way, it's time to flip over a bike, and it's hub motor time, baby. But as you can see, there's a green wrapping on the motor cable, and this actually goes back to the original part of the video where we were talking about how this guy actually had some issues with his build. And one of the major issues was that he tore his motor cable on his first test ride. So I needed to fix this for him before we can get this motor onto the bike. I was able to do this by soldering the motor cable back together. It was a super strenuous and annoying task. Don't ask me about it. Let's just get to mounting this motor onto our frame. So we do this by adding some spacers in between the motor and the swing arm of our frame. This is just going to make sure that we have some room for our motor cable so it's not completely twisted up so that it doesn't get torn again. So after we make sure to do this to both sides, it's time to put this motor onto our frame. This normally takes about 3 or 4 people to lift this bike up, but because I'm a stud, it only takes 1.
So what I'm realizing here is that because of the rear shock that my guy is putting on this thing, this bike is sitting super high up. Normally I'd go with like a 190 millimeter, but I think this is like a 230. Thankfully, the guy who I'm building this for is about as tall as me, so it shouldn't be too big of an issue. But man, is this thing sitting high up. And I think I'm gonna have to add a few more spacers to the seat to move it back.
Next, we use these nuts and screws to secure our motor to our frame. The screws go into the torque arms, which I added as spacers earlier in this video, and the bolts help clamp everything down. Once we got our motor nice and secure, I used zip ties to route our motor cable up into our frame. Next, I install my grips, throttle, LCD screen, and brake levers. For those of you who are worrying about getting a throttle or an LCD screen that matches your controller, typically higher end controllers are going to come with a throttle and LCD screen right out of the box. I next measure out the inside of the frame, more specifically where I'm going to be placing our battery. This is so that I can cut out some foam pads, which are going to be used to reduce vibrations going to the battery. With that being done, it usually would be time to put the battery in, but we're not going to be doing that right now because we have to figure out how to hook our fan and our lights up to this battery.
Alright, so you might be wondering why I have this assortment of items laid out right here. So basically, the guy I'm building this bike for requested both a lighting system and a built-in cooling fan that's going to plug directly into this bike's battery. But in order to do that, we have to use a voltage down step to take the 72 volts from the battery and convert it to the correct voltage for the use of the fan and the lights. But in order to do that, we have to hook this up either directly to the battery or, like somebody mentioned in my comments, to the positive and negative terminals of our controller, which is a much safer way to do it rather than what I've been doing, which is just connecting it straight up to the battery. Right here, I have some connectors. This is a XT90 connector, which is already hooked up to some terminal rings. And then these are just two generic connectors that I got from Amazon. So this is the one that we're going to be hooking up to the controller. This is the one that I'm going to be hooking up to our voltage downstep. Of course, I don't really care about this XT90 connector because all I care about right here are these two wires that already have the pre-connected terminal rings. Next, I'm going to go ahead, cut the head off of this, and I'm going to be soldering that onto these.
So if you're looking to build a bike and you want to add some accessories to it that connects straight up to the battery, like a light or a cooling fan or like a little horn or something, then you're going to want to go through this process. Essentially what we're doing is we're hooking up a voltage downstep, which takes the 72 volts from our battery, converts it down to whatever voltage we need for our little trinkets that we're adding to our bike. This way we can use them just off of the power of the battery. So if I can direct your attention back to what I'm doing right now, I'm making a little Frankenstein connector with those terminal rings so that we can hook this straight up to the controller. The final result was a little bit sloppy, but definitely usable, so that's connector number 1. For connector number 2, we're going to hook it straight up to this DC to DC converter. This way it makes things easier for us so that we can just hook this voltage downstep straight up to the controller without having to do any excess soldering on the inside of the frame. As you can see, there will be a little bit, but this makes things quite a bit easier. So in my last video, people were giving me a lot of trouble about using electrical tape to cover up these connections. Now, I might be a dull caveman boy, but isn't this what electrical tape is supposed to do? And as long as you wrap it well enough, shouldn't it be just fine, or am I tweaking? Finally, we can go ahead, hook up our homemade Frankenstein connector directly up to our battery terminals. By the way, if you're in your bed lying on your side while watching this video right now, y'all are some real ones, so make sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you don't hit the subscribe button, unfortunately, I'm going to have to come into your room and tickle your feet, so unless you're a freak and you want that to happen, make sure to go ahead and do that, and let's get into the next step. So once we've got that out of the way, we're rewarded by being able to put our battery in. So you slide it in. There's a technique to it. If you want me to do a separate video on how to slide your battery into your frame, leave that in the comments. Remember the hole we drilled into our frame at the beginning of the video? Well, it's time to mount our fan into that hole, and we're going to be using a hot glue gun to do this. In the comment section of my last build video, a lot of people were telling me that this was not a good way to do this, and that they wouldn't trust my build because I was using hot glue to mount the fan. And I'll call it what it is, efficiency. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it holds the fan in the bike just fine. The fan weighs a few ounces and has no weight being placed on it, so hot glue, bolts, I don't care as long as it's held in tight. Next, we're going to be gluing in our 72 volt DC to DC converter. This is what we're going to be running our fan and lights off of. And here we have the 24 volt lighting kit, which we're going to be using for this build. It comes with this nice tail light, this nice headlight, a switch, which is really cool, and these wires to connect everything up. And finally, a little mystery unboxing. We have a switch which is specifically made to turn our fan on and off, because obviously if we have it hooked up to the DC to DC converter without this switch, it's just going to be on all the time whether you want it to be or not. Next up, we're going to go ahead and mount all of this stuff up to our handlebars. We're not worried about hooking anything up right now, we're just worrying about getting it mounted. So I first start with the headlight using hot glue and zip ties to get it mounted to the front of our bike, and then we move to the tail light, which I use some zip ties to help get that mounted as well. Next, I take this switch, which is meant for our fan, in the control panel for our lights, and I put those on the handlebars as well. As you can see, I actually had to remove the throttle and the brakes in order to do this. And here's how we're looking. Pretty cool. I like this little control system here. Next, we're going to take this little bottom piece to our frame and route all of our wires through it and then up into our frame. If you guys want a tutorial on how to stick the wires through the hole and up into the frame, comment Sigma and I'll make sure to do that for you guys. Alright, so now we're getting everything hooked up. As you can see, I have this little piece here which is meant to hook all of the lights up together. We're not even worrying about the controller or the battery or the motor, hooking up any of that stuff right now. We're just worrying about the lights and the voltage downstep unit. Now, if you want to see a more in-depth video on how I hook everything up, I have that on my channel, so make sure to go ahead and check that out. But I'm telling you, even though it looks pretty complicated because there's a whole bunch of wires, it's actually a lot more intuitive and simple than you would think. At the same time though, it's kind of hard to explain when you're lazy like me. Next, we're going to go ahead and hook our motor cable up to our controller, simply matching the yellow, green, and blue wires up to the yellow, green, and blue ports in the controller. This was a little bit of a pain in the butt due to the fact that I had fixed the motor earlier. The motor cable was actually a little bit uneven, so this was super stressful for me, but once I finally got it in, we were all good to go and ready to put this controller into our bike. To mount the controller, I simply slide it into the inside of the frame, and then I use a bolt and a nut to tighten it down. Another little pro tip here, put some foam on the inside top of your frame. This way your controller doesn't rattle around. Now that we have everything in place on the inside of our frame, it's time to hook everything up. We're hooking the motor up to the controller, the battery up to the controller, and all of the components on our handlebars up to the controller. Again, this is completely separate from our voltage, downstep, and our lights. We already dealt with that. The only way that's connecting up to the actual controller itself are simply by those terminal rings, just so they can gain power and nothing else. And once we finally got everything connected, I plugged the power in last.
All right, lights. Check. Fan. Running nice and strong. And then finally, bike turns on, throttle works.
Now that we've confirmed that everything works and we're all happy, the next step is to organize the wires and get them tucked away in the frame. And with that, we're about 90% done with our build. Next, we're going to go ahead and add our brakes to this bike. For the rear brake, I'm using a Magura MT5. This is actually a gift to this guy. This was a brake that I just had laying around, and I figured I would put it on this bike because it would be pretty awesome. Now, as you can see here, I'm using a 203mm brake adapter to mount this brake and a few spacers. And after a little bit of time, love, care, and elbow grease, we got this thing figured out, and it's time to move on to the front brake system, which was a lot easier due to this 203mm brake mount, which came with these forks. All I really did was screw the brake in here. Like, this was the easiest brake install that I've ever done. After installing our brakes, I went back to these wires which are coming off of our handlebars, and I made sure to organize them. Actually, with the motor kit that you get on some of these bikes, they give you these wire organizers which are super useful, and you basically just wrap them around and make sure that's nice and good. This guy also bought this little number plate here, which I think was a super good idea because it looks awesome, and we were able to kind of tuck the wires away behind it, which I think is super cool. Next, we installed our decoy cranks to give the illusion that this is an e-bike and not a motorcycle. And with that, we can go ahead, cover up the electronics with the side panel, and this thing is ready for the road. Guys, look at this thing. It looks so awesome, and I can't wait to take this thing for a test ride.
All right, so we got this bike out into the sunlight, and I gotta say, this is one of my favorite looking bikes that I've ever built, hands down, and I think many of you would agree with me. I love this red, black, and white gold theme. It looks super cool, and I think the guy I'm building this for is going to be stoked about how this bike looks. Now, of course, before we can get this bike to him, I gotta run some tests on it just to make sure that it's not going to fall apart once we get this bike into his hands, which I don't really think is gonna happen. I just need an excuse to ride this bike. I mean, I know my guy's gonna be super happy about receiving his bike. I mean, of course he is. Look at these forks I'm giving him. By the way, I'm super jealous, and I wish I can keep these for myself, but he loves the channel, and I think giving him these forks would be a great way to give back to you guys. So if you're not already subscribed, what's your excuse? Without further ado, let's get on this thing and test it out. All right, so I'm so excited to finally be on this bike and riding it. This thing is feeling great so far, and I'm excited to put this thing to the test. Now, what I'm really excited to test is the suspension. I mean, this is pretty top of the line stuff, costs almost $1,000, and I'm really excited to see how it carries this bike off-road. But first, we're coming up on this nice long stretch of road, and I know you guys want to see it, so we're gonna go ahead and do a top speed run. I got the GPS going on my phone right here, so as soon as I get past this white line, I'm gonna pin the throttle, and we're gonna send this thing to the moon. Alrighty, let's get it. Woo! Okay, let's tuck in. It says we're going 60, 61. Wow. Whew. Okay, Jesus Christ. Oh my God. Okay, let me pull off to the side here. All right, moment of truth. We're gonna go to trip history. January 6th, 61.6 miles per hour. Guys, that is insane. And by the way, I'm a slightly larger than average guy. I know a lot of people say if you're under 200 pounds, you're like skinny or whatever, but you know, with all my gear on, I'm like 180, and a lot of people who are into e-bikes especially are not that heavy. So I think most of you, if you're looking to do this bike build for yourself, you might be going even faster than that. Now keep in mind, this is at a full charge. You're not always gonna be at that full charge. So you might not go over 60 on every single speed run, but gosh darn is that pretty darn. But gosh, all right, so now that we've tested this thing's top speed, I'm gonna go ahead and find a nice off-road trail where I can test out these forks, because these forks are definitely gonna be what I'm most intrigued in at this moment. As you can see right here, we found a nice little off-road trail where we can put this suspension to the test. I think this is gonna actually lead to the mesa where there's some more extreme kind of bumpy stuff. Might be a private road right here. Ooh, see, that was surprising. All right. Ooh, so there goes our motor cable. Something smells a little bit funky. This might not be good. Holy. And if you're wondering, this is why we test things out before we send them off. So keep in mind, this motor cable was completely severed, and I did have to try and fix it. So it's not like I was given a fresh slate of parts here to put this thing together. So I guess what we're gonna have to do here is just take this bike apart again and work on that motor cable. I think I'm gonna have to totally replace it, to be honest. So I'm almost certain it has to do with the motor. There's a lot of resistance going on right now, which is interesting.
So definitely not the ending I was hoping for with this video, but fortunately we do have a replacement motor cable, and I'm going to be attempting to replace the motor cable on this thing entirely instead of just fixing it up. Now, to put this into perspective, I have fixed up a few motor cables in the past and they've worked perfectly for years to come. But this is the first one which I couldn't quite fix because it was severed pretty badly. This bike did run for a couple attempts. I actually did ride the bike a little bit more than it showed on camera. Probably put 10 miles, to be honest, did a few speed runs, but that was just the one I showed you, and yeah, the bike crapped out on that one. So anyways, we're gonna get this thing fixed. I'm gonna get this bike to my guy one way or another, hopefully in the next week. And yeah, if you wanna see more on this bike in the future, make sure to go ahead, hit that like button, leave a nice comment down below, and I'll see you guys soon in the next one. Later.